Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Reverend Dr. David Cohen has been lecturing in biblical studies for 25 years. He began at Vose Seminary, which is here, as the head of biblical studies, and is currently the director of research for Morling College. David continues to teach Hebrew Bible and language at Morling College. In addition to this, he is the head of Bible and Languages at the Australian University of Theology, which involves overseeing faculty in all AUT colleges across Australia. David is also a fellow of ISCAST and has a continuing interest in how we read the biblical creation accounts well and how this influences discussions about faith and science. So, with nothing more ado, let's welcome David to the floor.
Thanks, Peter. I might just grab hold of this, if that's okay. And thanks again for the opportunity. I really enjoyed sharing with the group last year. It's good to come back again and share once more. And if you were here in the session last year, I can't quite remember. There might be a little bit of repetition of some of the things that I talked about. But just for those who don't know me, I don't come from a science background, so that's my caveat on my talk. The limit of my science is high school physics and chemistry, and that's really the end of it for me. I took another track in terms of academics, went into music and then into education and theology, and that's where I've stayed for the bulk of my career. But I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think one of the things I've noticed is that in the Christian context, many people have, like myself, have grown up in the church or have been in the church for a long time. And I think for some people, there's a sense in which I've been in the church for a long time, I'm a committed Christian person, and so therefore I know how to think theologically. One of the reasons this institution exists is because we want to help people to think theologically well. And people will always be theologians. Really the question is, how well do they do their theology? And so I come to this topic of human beings. I changed the topic a little bit. Originally it was human beings being human, but I've actually changed it to human beings becoming human, and I think that will become obvious, the reason for that, as I go further into this talk. At the end we'll have time for Q&A, so really happy to take your comments and hopefully respond with some helpful thoughts and ideas. So as I said, our focus tonight is on human beings becoming human. What does Genesis 1 to 4 tell us about people, and why does it matter? This isn't just an academic exercise. I think it's actually an exercise not just in understanding the biblical text, but actually understanding ourselves, because we're all human. And the biblical text, of course, is very much focused not only on humans, but certainly humans are a significant focus of the text. So we're going to look at the foundational narratives of Genesis 1 to 4, and particularly focus on 4 pivotal characters: Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. And my aim is to illuminate how the text itself presents these figures, and in doing that, how it shapes our understanding of them, and consequently our understanding of what it means to be human. I'm going to do this by engaging with a couple of theoretical frameworks and also some scholarship as well. So I'm using world text theory and discursive psychology. I'll talk a little bit about what they entail, and I'll do that in a moment. But I also want to bring that and the text itself into conversation with some of those scholars that have been working particularly in the area of Genesis 1 to 4, the creation accounts, Genesis 1 and 2, but also beyond that as well. The reason I've chosen Genesis 1 to 4 is because I find that in conversations over the years in churches, often the focus is on Genesis 1 and 2, the creation accounts, big focus on chapter 3, particularly in the evangelical context, and we kind of forget about chapter 4. But actually, if you look at it from a scholarship perspective, in some ways there's probably more connections between Genesis 3 and 4 than there are between Genesis 3 and 4 and Genesis 1 and 2. So I want to take them together and explore them. And I hope by the end of the exploration that you'll see how the figures of Adam, Eve, Cain and Abel function, not just as ancient characters, but as human identities that are constructed within and in response to specific ancient Near Eastern cultural contexts. Before we dive in, I want to outline just a few assumptions that I bring to this talk. The first one is that I'm assuming that the narratives of Genesis 1 to 4 are both etiological and teleological. Now, what I mean by that is that they tell us about how things came to be, as they are, but they also offer us a teleological vision of how things could be or ought to be. So I think they do both of those things. In addition to that, they also give us a picture, to some degree, of how things ought not to be. So they give us both a positive picture and a negative picture, if you will. The second one is that the text, in my view, is not primarily concerned with what happened or even how it happened from a historio-scientific perspective, but rather why things happened. And it achieves this by constructing a world through words and then filling that world with humans and other things, but our focus tonight will be on humans. And it uses words to construct concrete realities and also abstract concepts. The third one is, and this is an interesting one, particularly in the ancient Near Eastern context, the Genesis creation accounts particularly are not concerned with theogony. And what I mean by that is they're not concerned with the origins of the gods. Why that's interesting is because if you look at the other creation accounts in the ancient Near East, and there are quite a few of them, they all have something to say about where the gods came from. Biblical text is not interested in that. In the beginning, God. Bereshit bara Elohim. So in the beginning, God created, but God is there, present. Someone asked the question once, what was God doing before creation? And a rabbi responded and said, making a place called hell for people who asked that question. So talking about where God came from or what happened before is just not on the agenda. The second part of that is that the text does not really deal with cosmogony. What I mean by that is the origins of the cosmos. It deals with cosmology, which is the nature of the cosmos. So I think they're two interesting perspectives. The final one, and again this is based on the fact that it was in an ancient Near Eastern context, is that the biblical text is not interested in what we call theomachy, which is, if you've read Greek mythological writing and other ancient Near Eastern accounts, you'll find that there's a lot of fighting between the gods, fighting for supremacy. But actually what happens in Genesis is God is simply there and supreme. There's no question about whether there are other gods who want to fight or want to try to have victory of some kind over God. In fact, the interesting thing is that in some of those other creation accounts, creation comes about because of the gods battling one another. We don't see that in the biblical account. So, let me just make a couple of comments on theoretical frameworks. So, world text theory posits that texts give us internal clues that reveal what we might call the architecture of the world, the shape of the world. So when we read Genesis 1 to 2, we need to be attuned to the fact that this is an ancient Near Eastern text, and so the kind of world it's creating is a world that reflects ancient Near Eastern contexts. Now, as a simple example of that, you may be aware that in the creation account it talks about a beaten out plate between the heavens and the earth. Now, of course, we know that that's not the case. But if you look across the ancient Near Eastern world, what you'll find is it's a very common conception. There was this beaten out plate. The purpose of it was to withhold the waters from coming down from the heavens and flooding the earth. And of course, when the flood happens, a little later in Genesis, that beaten out plate somehow is removed or disappears or whatever, and the waters come down as well as coming up. So the architecture gives us a grid through which hearers can make sense of their world that is the world of the Bible, and then helping us to then make sense of our world, recognising that they are different. Discursive psychology, on the other hand, is less concerned with the architecture, the overall shape of the world, and it's more interested in the characters that populate the world. And that's what our focus will be tonight. So rather than looking at that overall perspective, discursive psychology argues that texts don't just describe what characters are like, it actually constructs them. So when we listen to what characters do, when we read what characters say, that's giving us a construction of what this character is actually like. So I'm going to tease that out with these specific examples as we go through. Big task, but I want to bring it into conversation with some of the scholars that I mentioned before that have been doing a lot of work in this area of Genesis. So John Walton, some of you may be familiar with some of his work, and just in very short summary, his perspective is that creation is about what you might call a functional ontology. So in other words, the things that fill the world and the world itself was created to be functional. In fact, Walton would argue that when it talks about God creating something, it's not so much talking about God creating something from nothing, ex nihilo, it's more the idea of God giving something function. So when it has function, it has been created. It may have existed before that, but existed without function. Richard Middleton focuses on the social ethics of the Imago Dei. So when it comes to human beings, what are the implications of the individuals whose constructs we read about in Genesis 1 to 4 for the way communities function? Eleanor Stump takes a more narrative psychological perspective into divine human relationships. So what's in the mind, what's the, if you like, the intrapsychic structure of humans that we read in the text. Barbara Deutschmann talks a lot about gender analysis, feminist hermeneutics. And then David Kelsey talks about a really big question. In fact, Michael O'Neill, one of my colleagues here at Morling, we were talking about a year ago now, and he said he felt that in theology, one of the biggest questions that we need to ask in the 21st century is the question of theological anthropology. So what does it mean to be a human from a theological perspective? And so David Kelsey is one of the people that's trying to grapple with that question. So that's a lot, and I don't know if we'll actually manage to cope with all of that, but we'll see how we go. So let's move on to Adam, the first human. So in the Hebrew, ha-adam, bit tricky talking about Adam because we've got ha-adam, which is, I would translate that as the human, and then of course we've got Adam, which becomes kind of a proper name, proper noun, an actual individual. But in the first creation account, Genesis 1:1 to 2 verse 4, we see ha-adam as the human. In terms of world architecture, ancient Near Eastern texts consistently feature primordial humans, often their kings, who mediate between divine and terrestrial realms. Mesopotamian texts, for example, position kings as mediators between God and people. But the Genesis text is interesting because it actually subverts that royal ideology. And what it does is it democratises the function. So in the case of Genesis 1:27, God created the human, or God created humans, people if you will, male and female. He created them and then he gives them dominion over the earth. He says, go out, subdue, have dominion over creation. And so that's a democratisation of power. Normally in the ancient Near East you'd expect kings to have that power. Here, humans are given that power. So Richard Middleton says that this is a deliberate critique of imperial power structures. It's basically saying kings think that they are the ones who mediate between God and people, but actually it's people themselves, it's humans themselves. So straight away, the text is constructing a different kind of human to the one that an ancient Near Eastern person might imagine. Eleanor Stump's approach, I think, is helpful here because she talks about the Ha-Adam's character developing through relational encounters. So as the human interacts with creation and interacts ultimately with other humans, their identity develops. Now, they don't necessarily think about what they're like, but they discover what they're like as they interact with their environment through dialogue. So, for example, in chapter 3, after they've eaten from the tree, and God walks in the garden and says to Adam, "Where are you?" So that question prompts the human to try to answer that question. Where am I? Not just in a spatial sense, but where am I in relationship to God, which again reflects on the character of the individual. Or, if you think of another instance, God, it's interesting language, God builds or constructs the woman and brings the woman to the man, and the man says, in part, "You are bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." So again, in the interaction, the relational interaction, the man is discovering something about himself, and then he's also discovering something about the other. I had a student many years ago who was writing an essay on this topic, and I can't remember it verbatim what they said, but it was something like, when the woman came to the man, they both recognised their humanity in one another. And the implication was that without the other, they were not able to recognise their full humanity. So in the Genesis text, what we find is that it's through encounter that the individuals are constructed, developing through relational encounters. When we talk about the discursive building blocks, it's interesting as well because, as I said, the Hebrew word for Adam, is not so much a proper name, but it's more a human, integral to the cosmos's architecture. In fact, if you read Genesis chapter 1 particularly, if there's no human in that schema, in that architecture, then there's a lack in creation. If you go to Genesis 2, if there's no other human apart from the human, there's a lack in that architecture. And so it's building a picture of what creation looks like. So the character of the individual is built through relationship to other elements. So for example, Adam, the human, comes from Adamah, which is the soil. So there's a connection between the two. The human is also a breath receiver. So they receive the Ruach Elohim, the breath of God. They're a living being. They're a nefesh chai, a living soul, a living being. And so all of that comes in relationship to God, a living being. And they're also functional because they're a garden tender, they're an animal namer, and ultimately they're a boundary transgressor, which is what we encounter in chapter 3. So thinking about functional ontology, it's interesting because the text doesn't seem to be interested so much in where Adam came from, where the human came from, but what is the human's function in the garden? And this is John Walton's program, where he wants to look at creation and say, well, if things don't have a function, then they're not actually created things. And the basis for that really is, if you look at all of the other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts, the context, function is front and centre. That's what gives us a sense of who these individuals are. What's also interesting with that, of course, is that Walton goes on to say that the imagery in creation is the imagery of a temple. And so the human's function is to be a priestly figure, one who cares for the temple, one who tends the temple. And Adam's identity is created through performance utterances. So God says things like, in the image and the likeness of God, God created them. So the speech actually constitutes how or who these characters are. The other interesting thing about this is that there's a gendered dimension. So Ha-Adam is gender neutral. I know a lot of the older translations, in fact even some of the newer translations, tend to translate it as man. I always find it odd when you read Genesis 1:27 and 28. God created them male and female. God created him. Sounds a bit odd. So, but it's tricky in English. How do we actually manage that? But the idea is that it's gender neutral, at least in the first instance. But Deutschmann notes that it becomes increasingly masculinized. So what we end up with eventually in the second chapter is a changing of the terminology. So when God builds the woman, constructs the woman, and brings the woman to the man is then called ish, which is the common word in Hebrew for man, and the woman is given the word isha. So you can hear the connection in Hebrew, ish, isha. It's even there in English because it says she is woman because she comes from man. So you've got the same kind of linguistic connection there. But it's interesting because the gender identity emerges through social positioning. She is opposite the man, or she is alongside the man. There's different language used in different sections. And David Cohen says that when we get to Genesis 3, what we see is a disruption of that relationship. So the ideal picture, if you will, is in Genesis 1 and 2. That's how, or Genesis 2, that's how the male-female relationship ought to function. In Genesis 3, we see a disruption of that. So let's talk a bit about Eve. So the world of Eve. In ancient Near Eastern texts, typically primordial females are defined through male-dependent categories. So they're dependent on males to be defined. If I give you an example of this, this is an interesting one in Judges. You know Deborah, the judge. So when Deborah is first introduced into the text, she is called Deborah in most English translations. In fact, pretty much every English translation I'm aware of, she's called Deborah, the wife of Lapidot. Now, the interesting thing there is that if you look at the Hebrew, the word wife can be translated as woman. It can be woman or wife, either one. It's Isha. And Lapidot is actually the word for flames. So you could quite validly translate that as Deborah, the woman of flames. But by translating it as, Deborah, the wife of Lapidot, you've automatically made her identity dependent on a male. Now, I'm going to argue which one is best to translate it, because the truth be told, you can translate it either way. But translating it as wife of Lapidot actually reflects the typical ancient Near Eastern way of referring to women. Women typically are the wife of someone or the mother of someone in that sense. So gender identity emerges through social patterning. And as I said, there's that disruption of that in chapter 3. Eve receives her name, so this is interesting because Eve gets a name which is Chava in the Hebrew, but she's only named after the events of chapter 3. Chava is an interesting word because it seems to come from the Hebrew verb chava, which means to live or to be alive. So she's the mother of all living. But again, she's defined in terms of function. So it's not something that is describing an intrinsic quality, but it's more something that's describing a functional quality that she has. But the text also portrays her as possessing an independent relationship with God. She converses directly with God, and she converses with the serpent. She has agency. Now, that may not surprise you. Most of you sitting here, probably all of you sitting here, would say, of course she has agency, she's a human. But in the ancient Near Eastern context, women were not known, they wouldn't have used the word agency, but they were not known to have agency. They were given agency, or, to put it in plain terms, they were told what to do by their husband or by their community. They didn't have agency themselves. Eve does. Richard Middleton's social ethics perspective suggests that Eve's construction challenges and subverts hierarchical assumptions. We can miss this because we don't necessarily live in a similar context. It's undeniably embedded in a patriarchal discourse. Her construction of agency provides fertile ground for an egalitarian interpretation of the text. Unlike Adam, Eve actually emerges as a character gradually in the text. Adam is kind of just there. But Eve appears through divine recognition of human relational need. The man, the human, is alone and needs something. The animal's not sufficient and so needs another human. So she appears in that construct. Her identity construction unfolds through multiple and sometimes conflicting threads. Barbara Deutschmann says that it's absolutely crucial here that Eve's construction is seen to be embedded in a patriarchal discourse. She emerges from male embodiment. Isn't it interesting that the woman comes from the man? And of course, ultimately then the man, down the track, the man comes, everyone, men and women, but the man comes from the woman. It's a key. She simultaneously demonstrates autonomy of agency and moral decision making, even though she is in relationship with the man. This leads us to the heart of her agency and subversion. Eve is discursively positioned as the companion to the man. And again, if I can refer to the Hebrew here, so the word used to describe her as a helper, which is, in my view, a very unfortunate translation, is azer, which typically is a word that's attributed to God. So God is, if you read through the Hebrew Bible, almost every time azer is used, it's a description of God coming to the assistance of humans. So that's how she's described, as a helper. Some might even say, certainly not in a subordinate sense, and some might even say in a superior sense. She's also a decision maker. She looks at the tree and she determines that it's good. Now the creation accounts have said that these things are good, but she looks at that and she makes that statement herself. She's also a theological interpreter because she says, God said we shall not eat of that tree. And you could say that she's also an interpreter because she goes on to add something, doesn't she? She says we shouldn't eat from the tree or touch the fruit. So she adds an added dimension of interpretation. So Eve's character exemplifies what we might call a resistant agency. She has autonomy, she has agency, and we probably wouldn't expect that in an ancient Near Eastern context, in an ancient Near Eastern text. Her dialogue with the serpent powerfully reveals her theological reflection. As I said, she adds to what God has said, and she says, well, not only should you not eat it, but you shouldn't actually touch it as well. David Kelsey suggests that Adam and Eve's actions in Genesis 3 should be understood as discursive rather than psychological categories. What he means by that is that there's no evidence in the text to suggest that they thought about the consequences of what they were doing. They simply have the conversation. The woman has the conversation with God, the woman has the conversation with the man, and then they both have the conversation with God. It's in the conversation, it's in the speech that we discover what the consequences will be. Crucially, as you know, as well as I do, the relationship between Adam and Eve changes as a consequence of the actions in chapter 3. So, as characters, they change as people as a result of their actions. And we move to Cain. So, he's a figure whose story introduces violence into the biblical text. We've not seen violence prior to this. And so looking at Cain in world architecture, Middleton says that, from a social ethics framework, that Cain's violence emerges not from purely individual factors but from systemic ones. So what he's actually arguing there is that we read in the text a person committing murder, but what we're really reading is about the violence of humans. So it's kind of archetypal, if you want to use that sort of language. Cain's discursive construction, which is rejecting the older sibling, is a pattern that recurs throughout Genesis the Genesis ancestral narratives. It's systemic. It's a systemic human problem. Barbara Deutschmann's analysis highlights the gendered dimensions of Cain's violence. Male identity in ancient contexts often demanded social recognition. Cain's violence seems to emerge from the frustrated needs of wanting to be recognised, because as you know from the story, they both bring a sacrifice. God recognises Abel's sacrifice but doesn't recognise Cain's sacrifice. So Cain's response is violence. The divine response, God's response to Cain, is fascinating, and it leads to what we might call an identity reconstruction. So we're seeing the building of this character. What does God do? God puts a mark on Cain which functions as protective. So even though Cain has committed a sin, if you want to put it in those terms, he is still protected by God's grace. And it demonstrates that narrative frameworks like this can give resources for not just identifying where people have done something out of character or done something wrong, but also opportunities for them to be reintegrated into society. I find it interesting with Cain that he is sent away, but he's given protection so he can continue to live. And I would categorise that as an act of God's grace. It's the same if you go back a little bit to them being cast out of the garden, Adam and Eve. They're thrown out of the garden, but they're not, in a sense, alone. God is still with them. God has still given them a mandate. It's just slightly different to what it was beforehand. What's interesting as well is that in these situations we don't get a lot of description in the text about how people are feeling or thinking internally. It's very typical of Hebrew narrative that if you want to know what a person is feeling or thinking, you read what they say and you look at what they do. You read what they say and you look at what they do. So it's typically in the Hebrew Bible, it's not going to say things like, this person was angry, or this person was sad, or this person was depressed. But you will see through their speech, or hear through their speech, or see through their actions what the case is. But God actually names it in the Cain story, because God says to Cain, why are you angry? So Cain hasn't said that he's angry, but that's what we hear in the story. Cain's emotional state is acknowledged through divine recognition and the subsequent dialogue. The divine warning, sin is crouching at the door, offers what I think is quite a profound theological and psychological insight. And that insight is that there is choice involved. And you know, when you think about it in our contemporary context, I think this is very important. According to this story, it's not sufficient and probably not even right to say something like, well, I just couldn't help myself. I was angry and I killed him. Sin is crouching at the door, but there's a choice involved as to whether you submit to that sin or not. So Cain's identity is not static, it's fluid. And I think it's been continually constructed through these engagements, both with, in this case, with Abel and then also with God. So Cain's character construction is based on a development through social interaction. So as we read in the text, the way they talk to one another, the way God speaks to them, the things that they say, it gives us a sense of the character of this individual, how it's being built. Again, Walton's functional ontology is really helpful here as well. Cain's occupation is described as a tiller of the ground. Initially, that positions himself within this cosmic temple of creation as a cultivator. As we know, his offering receives no divine acceptance. And that creates an identity crisis. And this is a common human problem that we all have at different times. So it's almost, what I'm suggesting here, it's almost like Cain is every person. Eve is every person. Adam is every person. We can see ourselves in those characters as they are built within the text. Well, finally, let's have a look at Abel. So the world of Abel. Abel's character is very interesting. Abel's shepherding position in the cosmic temple of creation is fascinating because in ancient Near Eastern contexts, it's often ascribed a higher value than pastoral identity. Pastoral identity is given a higher value than agricultural identity, suggesting that Abel's construction here is as the righteous person, the right person, and Cain's is the unrighteous person. Kelsey reminds us that Abel's continuing presence in divine memory is very, very significant. So you'll recall the words, God says that Abel's blood is crying from the ground. Abel doesn't exist anymore, at least as a living person. It's also fascinating that when we get to Hebrews chapter 11, it's a big jump from where we are in Genesis, but we get to Hebrews chapter 11 verse 4, and it demonstrates how identity construction actually transcends biological existence by a long way. Abel is talked about as being a witness. It says in Hebrews 11 verse 4 that through his faith he still speaks. Isn't that interesting? Through his faith he still speaks. Middleton's perspective suggests that Abel's victimisation creates what we might call social debt. His death generates an ongoing moral obligation. In other words, Cain has committed murder and he doesn't get off scot-free. There's a consequence for that. Certainly he experiences God's grace, but he's sent out. He's given a mark for protection, but the consequences are very obvious. And focusing on Abel's discursive building blocks, this is interesting. So these are the building blocks that we get from what these characters say. And of course the interesting thing with Abel is he doesn't say much, does he? So how do we get any building blocks from that? Well, this is the interesting thing because building blocks can be silent as well. So it's not just what people say, it's what they don't say. It's how they respond or how they don't respond. As I said, he doesn't say these words, but God says of Abel that his blood cries from the ground. I mentioned that a moment ago. And so it's almost like Abel's voice speaks, even though it doesn't literally speak. The voice has agency and it can transcend the human person. Abel's post-mortem discourse vividly demonstrates the ancient understanding of how violence creates continuing social disruption. Again, this is about humanity. This is not just about Cain and Abel. It's a story of what happens when one human inflicts violence on another human. It has implications that go way beyond the event itself, and in fact way beyond the individuals themselves. So, oops. Oh, it doesn't want to go. That's interesting. Ah.
Left click.
Oh, we'll just do. There we go. Okay, that was an interesting one. All right. So some concluding thoughts. Let me just skip over here. So first of all, I want to suggest that the picture that we gain of these characters is a picture that's gained through listening to what they say and listening to what is said about them. And it seems to me that that's how ancient texts create these characters. So they create a world and then they create the characters within that world. Identity construction occurs through relational positioning. So as we read the text, we've got to think about how is this person related to the other? Are they equal? Are they subordinate? Are they superior? Where do they fit in that schema? The third one is that the Genesis world text both participates in but also subverts contemporary ancient Near Eastern identity construction patterns. And that's a fancy way of saying it turns the world upside down. John Goldingay, who's another Old Testament scholar, uses the term condescending. So what he means by that is that God, at various points in various ways, condescends to us as humans. He's not using condescension in a pejorative sense, what he's suggesting is that God comes and works and speaks in terms that we understand. So, as an example of that, if you're wondering why the covenant in Deuteronomy is in the form that it's in, well, you just need to look at ancient Near Eastern context. Because for an ancient Near Eastern person, they would have understood that covenant structure like we appreciate bread and butter or something like that. It would be something that's very common to their understanding. But, and here's the interesting thing, sometimes God will subvert those structures as well, turn them upside down. Some people have referred it to God's upside down world, the way we think it should function as humans and the way that God actually intends it to function. The fourth one is that understanding the biblical characters through these kinds of frameworks, I think encourages us to think about some really pressing questions that are pertinent today. Questions of human dignity. What does that look like? Questions of moral agency. And questions of community formation. So who we are as humans, how we become human, hence the title of my talk, and how we function in community are all tied together. And I want to suggest to you that I think as we read these characters and how they become human in the sense that I've described, I think they can give us pause for reflection on what it means for us to be human. The characters that we've examined today, Adam, Eve, Cain and Abel, contain powerful resources for contemporary reflection. I think understanding the way that they are constructed in the text helps us in our own understanding. Ongoing identity construction is something that's important. So I think, the reason I changed the title was because I think in a sense we're always becoming human. I think sometimes we sort of think we are human, which we are, but there's a sense in which we're becoming human as well. The divine other, God continues to speak human beings into existence. I don't think that when it talks about in Genesis, in the beginning God created, the intended takeaway from that or inference from that is that God created and that was the end of the process. I think it was just the beginning of the process, and I think that process continues today. So, there are a few thoughts. I've probably bitten off too much to chew in terms of bringing different ideas and thoughts together, but hopefully there's some things that you picked up to consider. So, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take comments or questions if there are any.